For as long as I could remember, my life had been a series of rules, expectations, and limitations. My parents, well-meaning but overbearing, controlled almost every aspect of my life. They had a strict set of values that dictated what I could wear, where I could go, and even who I could be friends with. Their love for me was undeniable, but their need to shield me from the world was suffocating. I had always felt like an outsider in my own home. While other kids my age experienced freedom and independence, I was stuck in a cycle of obedience and routine. My every decision, no matter how small, had to be approved by them. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live life on my own terms. The breaking point came one evening when my parents decided to enforce yet another ridiculous rule. I was forbidden from going to my best friend's birthday party because they didn't approve of her rebellious nature. I had tried to reason with them, explaining that it was just a harmless gathering, but they wouldn't listen. I felt a burning frustration inside, like my very soul was being stifled by their constant control. That night, while everyone else was preparing for the party, I made a decision that would change everything. I packed a bag with a few essentials, clothes, some money I had saved, and my phone. I knew that leaving was risky, but at that moment, the thought of being trapped under their rules any longer seemed unbearable. I slipped out of the house in the dead of night, my heart racing with both fear and exhilaration. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a way. Away from the suffocating grasp of my parents. Away from the life they had planned for me. I thought I could finally breathe freely. I caught a bus to the nearest city, a place I had always dreamed of exploring. It felt like stepping into an entirely new world. The bright lights, the buzz of the streets, and the anonymity of being just another face in the crowd filled me with a sense of excitement I had never felt before. For the first time in years, I felt free. But deep down, a small voice whispered that freedom came at a cost, one I hadn't fully understood yet. At first, life outside the bubble of my parents' rules was everything I had hoped for. I rented a small, modest apartment in the city, using the money I had saved up from part-time jobs. It was a cramped space, but it was mine. For the first time, I could make my own choices, live my own life, and go wherever I wanted without asking for permission. I spent my days exploring the city, meeting new people, and soaking in the kind of freedom I had only dreamed of. I found a job at a small cafe, making just enough to cover rent and living expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of independence I hadn't known I was craving. I made new friends, people who didn't know me as the obedient, rule-following daughter. To them, I was just another person, figuring out life in the big city. The anonymity was liberating, and I quickly adapted to my new life. But as the days turned into weeks, the initial thrill began to fade. What I had thought was freedom soon revealed itself to be isolation. I missed my family. Despite everything, they had been my world. The phone calls and messages from my parents became more frequent, each one filled with worry, guilt, and concern. At first, I ignored them, convinced that I was doing the right thing. But eventually, the constant pressure from home started to weigh on me. I had always been close to my mother, and her absence in my life was especially painful. I hadn't realized how much I missed her until I no longer had her presence to lean on. Every time I tried to reach out, the guilt over leaving her behind ate away at me. But it wasn't just guilt that weighed on my shoulders. It was the reality of trying to navigate life on my own. I was starting to see the cracks in the freedom I had fought for. The independence I had longed for felt lonely and uncertain. I didn't have the safety net I once had. No longer could I rely on my parents for advice, guidance, or even just a comforting voice at the end of a difficult day. The city, for all its vibrancy, felt like a cold and unfamiliar place. One night, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the phone in my hand. I had an overwhelming urge to call my parents, to tell them I was okay, to hear their voices. But I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. The pride and stubbornness that had driven me to leave in the first place now stood in the way of returning to them. As the weeks went on, the weight of my decisions grew heavier. I had gained the freedom I had so desperately wanted, but I hadn't considered the price that came with it: loneliness, uncertainty, and the growing realization that I might have made a mistake. The life I had chosen wasn't as simple as I had imagined. I began to ask myself, was the cost of freedom really worth the price? The turning point came on a cold evening, about 2 months after I left home. I had been feeling increasingly disconnected, the weight of my choices settling in more heavily each day. The freedom I had once cherished felt hollow, and I was starting to doubt myself. I had no family close by to lean on, and though I had made new friends in the city, it wasn't the same. No one truly knew me like my parents did, and I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that I had thrown away something irreplaceable. That night, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled with emotion as she asked, "When are you coming home, sweetheart? We miss you so much. Your dad and I are worried." She didn't blame me for leaving. She didn't even sound angry. She just sounded heartbroken. That's when it hit me. In trying to escape their control, I had inadvertently broken their hearts. I felt a lump form in my throat, and the reality of what I had done hit me like a ton of bricks. The weight of my decisions, my pride, my desire for independence, had caused pain that I wasn't prepared to face. My freedom had come at the expense of the love and security my parents had always provided. They hadn't asked me to stay under their control. They had only wanted to protect me. And in my quest for freedom, I had pushed them away. I sat on the couch in my apartment, staring at the phone, unable to answer. The guilt was overwhelming. How could I go back now? How could I admit that I had been wrong, that the freedom I had so desperately wanted had left me more lost than ever? For the first time in a long while, I understood the true cost of independence. It wasn't just about the right to make my own decisions. It was about the relationships I had sacrificed along the way. It was the connection with my family, the warmth of being surrounded by people who cared for me, even when they didn't agree with everything I did. After a long, sleepless night, I made the decision to return home. I couldn't undo the past, but I knew I had to try to rebuild the bridge I had burned. It wasn't just about going back to the safety of home. It was about facing the consequences of my actions, acknowledging the hurt I had caused, and finding a way to make amends. When I finally walked through the door of my childhood home, my parents didn't greet me with anger or disappointment. They welcomed me with open arms, their eyes filled with love and understanding. It wasn't easy to apologize, and it wasn't easy to admit that I had been wrong. But in that moment, I realized that freedom wasn't about escaping the rules or running away from responsibility. It was about understanding the value of the people in your life and the balance between independence and connection. I had learned the hard way that the consequences of seeking freedom without considering the people who care for you can be more painful than the constraints you were trying to escape. And though I had found my way back home, I would never take the love and support of my family for granted again.